For a long time in this business, when we do studies of student achievement, the focus is almost always on mathematics and reading. Sometimes science creeps in, sometimes writing, but always reading and mathematics are the sine qua non. And yet, for a lot of students, the mathematics and reading isn't the primary issue. We're more interested in how engaged they are in school and looking at a much broader set of outcomes. I have this little learning bar again, which isn't really based on a lot of high-powered research. It's just kind of life according to Doug Wilms about what things I think are important to measure at various stages of children's and youth development. So I started ages 1 and 2, or you could really say birth, focusing on language development. And then we moved to the readiness skills, the kinds of skills that are measured in the early years evaluation. And then we have this period after kids start grade 1 through to about the end of grade 3 where the primary focus is really on getting children to read. And around age 2 or 3, they need to make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn. So near the end of elementary school, the focus is really on continuing on the skill building, improving children's reading skills. And then they enter middle school. And once they enter middle school, you've got a lot of students who can read well, but they become disaffected from school. They become disengaged. They don't have a strong sense of belonging at school. They're not really sure they value schooling outcomes anyway, and they are prone to dropping out and a whole host of other problems. And so we're interested in that stage of schooling, and that's the stage that's covered by Tell Them From Me. So in terms of our evaluation tools then, we have the early years evaluation covering students from about ages 3 through to the end of kindergarten. We're even using it in grade 1, just as students start grade 1. Then we like to look at literacy trajectories, how well kids are doing in their skills as they move from grade 1 through to grade 3. We've just started thinking about developing skills modules. They're not really developed yet, but I really want to see some smaller units of learning that kids can get engaged in. Much like the what used to be the Red Cross swimming badges. When I was a child, we had, I don't know, they went tadpole, minnow, all the way up to being a leapfrog, something like that. Now they're more fancy with 10 levels. And I think kids could be much more engaged if they had smaller units and they can say, well, now I got this set of skills down pat. And they don't have to be directly linked to the curriculum. That would be helpful, but something that kids can value and see their progress. So it's very transparent then about where their skills are for both students and parents. And then finally, Tell Them From Me, which is this online evaluation system really aimed at giving students a voice in their own evaluation. So let me start in this early section. I'm just going to run through these in this module. That first one on language development, the focus is really on language and communication and social and emotional development. Children start developing language right from birth, or arguably even before then. Some recent studies have shown that even when a child is 2 or 3 weeks old, they can distinguish between the voice of their mother and the voice of another female. So there's something that's going on there even before they're born. There's some fascinating work being done at University of British Columbia by Janet Worker, who exposes kids to different sound systems and different language systems during the first 3 months after they're born. And then she looks at their skills at 9 months of age, and kids can actually recognize, they can distinguish, say, between Hindi sounds and English sounds at 9 months. They can't say the words, but they can already distinguish among those sounds. So there's a lot going on in those little brains right from birth as children develop their language. This is one of my favorite graphs. It's based on work by Susan Huntlocker at the University of Chicago. What she does is she looks at children's language development from about age 12 months through to about 36 months. Kids are fascinating at that age, at 12 months of age, because that's usually when most kids say their first word and everyone gets all excited. And then a couple weeks later, they know 5 or 6 words, and then it's just this rapid acceleration for most children. What I'm showing here, what Janet Worker does is she measures, again, in a continuous way, using leading indicators, language development as children are developing over that period. So about every 2 months, she watches children interacting with their mothers and has a system for discerning how many words children actually know. So on the y-axis on this graph, what you see is the number of words children know at a certain age. And each one of those lines is one of the children in our study. And this, not very many children, some 26 children I think are in this graph. And there's a nice little formula there. That black line shows the average growth trajectory, the average rate of development. And the formula goes like this. You can take the child's age in months, subtract 12, because that's usually when kids say their first word, square it and double it. And that'll give you roughly the number of words a child will know at that age. So, for example, take a child at 2 years of age, or 24 months, subtract 12, you get 12, square it, you get 144, and double it, you get 288 words. So if you look at the graph, and you go from 24 months up to the black line, come across, you get about 288 words. And what Huttenlocher showed is that the kids who are on very fast trajectories, most often they're with very talkative mothers. Children who are with talkative mothers are typically having 400 or 500 words, whereas children with less talkative mothers only 100 or 200 words. Now, most audiences would laugh when they hear this, but feel free to laugh. It's the truth, though. Recently, another group of researchers, Hart and Riley, have replicated this work using much larger samples. They've written a nice book called Meaningful Differences. And what they show is that children vary a tremendous amount in their exposure to language, and particularly language in the home. And so there's wide variation in the actual number of words kids get exposed to. And what they suggest is it takes about an exposure of about 7 or 8 times for a child to actually learn that word. So if they hear the word mango, they won't know the word mango until they've heard it 7 or 8 times. And I think that's the wonderful thing about reading to a child. You know, most kids will say, "Can you read it again? Can you read it again?" They want the same book over and over. And it's probably their natural sense that they need to hear that 7 or 8 times before they actually get the language and reinforce it. On this graph, we've got red lines for girls and green line for boys. And even at this age, girls are developing their skills much more quickly than boys. And that carries right on through till when they enter school. Well, I saw Paul back there madly calculating and figured at his age he ought to know about 2 billion words. But in fact, the line goes up and then it rises up and levels off. And if you track kids' literacy skills as they're going into school, it's rising up and leveling off, but it's also widening out. If I go into a typical grade 3 classroom and I look at, say, reading scores, the rough rule of thumb is that 1 standard deviation is about 1 grade level. Remember a standard deviation? You go plus or minus 1, and it'll get 2/3 of everyone, plus or minus 2, 95% of everyone. So if I go to a grade 3 teacher, they'll say, yeah, I've got some kids, a few kids that are reading down at the grade 1 level, but I've also got some kids up at the grade 5 level. And that's typical variation at the grade 3 level. Now you go to a secondary school, say around grade 9 or grade 10, 1 standard deviation on most tests is about 2 grade levels. And you talk to a grade 9 teacher and they'll say, yes, I do have some kids who are down at the grade 5 level in their reading skills. And I've got some kids who probably could handle university material. And the sad thing is that when you look at those trajectories for kids, those that are in that bottom group, round about age 3, their trajectories basically remain flat right the way through school. Some of them even go down. Kids who don't make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn by the end of grade 3 are usually struggling readers, and most school systems, and in fact I don't know any that do a good job of getting those kids back on track after grade 3. So just to summarize this part of it, children make better progress in school if they enter kindergarten with strong language and communication skills. Language development depends on a child's exposure to a quality and quantity of language. So it's not just the quality of the language, it's also the quantity. They need to hear those repetitions. Here are those outcomes that I talked about with the early years evaluation. And I say again, there's quite a consensus. These are the same set of domains that UNESCO uses, same set of outcomes that are in the various studies in the US that have looked at the kinds of skills children need when they enter kindergarten. So awareness of self and environment, social skills, behavior and approaches to learning, cognitive development, language development, and physical development. In our work with our National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, in 1994, it used to be called HRDC, Human Resources Development Canada, funded a huge longitudinal study called the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, and sampled some 22,000 children across Canada, roughly about 2,000 children in each province. And since 1994, have been following those children longitudinally, examining their cognitive outcomes, their language outcomes, behavioral outcomes, and so on. And when we looked at that data initially, just with the first couple of cycles of the data, there were really 4 big factors that came out as being most important. Parenting styles, family functioning, maternal depression, and engagement, that is engagement of the parents. Let me just say a little bit about parenting styles. The way the literature talks about parenting styles is they talk about parents on the one hand who are authoritarian. Barbara Coloroso uses the term brick wall, the brick wall parents, or it's my way or the highway kind of thing. Very rigid in their rules and so on. And then you've got, on the other side, permissive parents. Parents who are kind and loving and warm, but not too big on rules. Anything goes. People talk about grandparents being that way because they can come in and be warm and loving and not have to worry about setting the social agenda. And then you've got, in between and above those, authoritative parents. Authoritative parents have this combination of love and warmth and what's called demandingness. There's a social agenda here. It's not anything goes. There's a set of rules, and kids know what happens when they step out of bounds and what happens when they're in bounds. And it's that combination of love and warmth combined with a social agenda, if you can call it that, a structure, a rule structure, demandingness, demanding mature behavior and so on. It's that combination that leads to authoritative parenting style. And that, having an authoritative parenting style has very big effects. It's even, the effects of having an authoritative parenting style is even bigger than the effects associated with living in poverty. Very, very important. And especially when you look at behavioral outcomes. I had my wife, Ann, who's sitting at the back there, had bought tickets to go and see Barbara Coloroso when she was here and wanted me to go, and I was busy. No, I can't go. So she went and got one of her neighbors to go. And I'm still sitting at my computer an hour and a half, 2 hours later, and this neighbor came flying in, most uncharacteristic of her, and she says, "Doug, am I a jellyfish?" Jellyfish are the permissive parents, right? So you've got brick walls, jellyfish, and backbone parents. And I said, no, relax. We're all jellyfish at times, and we're all brick walls at times, thank goodness. And it's really that average of combining those two most of the time that puts you in that backbone parent mode. Okay. And I'll just say a little bit about family functioning. Family functioning is not just about how well the two parents are getting along, but it's really about the family operating as a cohesive unit and feeling that they can support each other in times of crisis, that there's a bit of a sense of democracy, and so on. Maternal depression, we had about 10% of mothers who suffer depression. In many cases, it's postpartum depression, but amongst mothers who suffer postpartum depression, for many of them it lasts for several years thereafter. And that is a very important predictor of some of those early childhood outcomes. And then finally, engagement. And we look in our studies at various aspects of parental engagement and extent to which parents are playing board games with kids and involved going to the park with them and all of that. The one aspect of engagement, reading to the child, that has more powerful effects than all the other ones combined. Reading to the child daily has very strong effects, not only on their language development, but on all of the other outcomes as well. Dr. Fraser Mustard, who has been one of the great leaders in Canada on early childhood development, really emphasizes the importance of reading to the child on brain development, because he says when you're reading to a child, a young child, you can't do it without being physically close to that child, and you get all of the senses going. You got the sense of smell, the sense of touch, sound, and everything all operating together, which is why it has such a powerful effect. Here's our early years evaluation, which is an online evaluation for teachers measuring these 5 domains of achievement. I won't go over it again. After kids enter kindergarten, we've also been following them on a number of other skills that aren't included in the early years evaluation. We use an instrument called the DIBELS, the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Learning Skills. This particular skill is called letter naming fluency, which has to do with kids are shown a list of letters and they simply read them off to you, and the teacher has a stopwatch and they say how many can they read in a certain time period. And we've got about 100 schools in New Brunswick involved, 50 schools in New Brunswick, about 1,000 kids, kindergarten children in New Brunswick doing this each year. Now we're up to about 3,000 or 4,000 children involved in this study. And we track their skills on a number of these measures. This is just like the Susan Huttenlocher line, this is the average trajectory across the province on this particular skill called letter naming fluency. Now, take a look at this next graph. This next graph plotted the average line of each of the children in one particular kindergarten classroom. So this particular kindergarten teacher has about 3 or 4 kids that are, if you could call it, say, falling off track. They're down there, well below the provincial line. And the problem is at this age, you don't know whether they're Franklin the turtle, they're going to plod along slowly all the way along, or whether they're Leo the late bloomer, if you know that book, that they're going to go along and then all of a sudden they're going to take off. You don't really know, but the important thing is those 4 kids are probably going to need some intervention to get them back on track. And some may get back on track sooner than others, but you can see there real clearly which kids need some extra help to keep on schedule. Here's another classroom. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this kindergarten teacher has a wholly different job than that first kindergarten teacher. And there's a real classroom, real kids, real data, and most of the kids are below the line. There would be an example where you not only want a performance-targeted intervention for those kids, but you'd also want a universal intervention in a small sense. You'd probably want to put an extra teacher in that classroom or a teacher's aide or whatever to give some extra support to those kids. Because there you've got a lot of kids with very shallow trajectories all clustered in the same classroom. In this work, I think we need to stop thinking about school readiness as a characteristic of children. You often hear the term learning readiness or ready to learn. All children are ready to learn. It's an innate desire of children to learn. Instead, we need to think about learning readiness as characteristics of the school. Are the schools ready to take the kids that are coming at them? Or a characteristic of families? Are families ready to engage in that process? Or a characteristic of communities? What can communities do to make sure all kids enter kindergarten with the skills they need to succeed? Let me just talk a little bit about reading. The ability to read is a fundamental skill for children's success. In fact, if I had my way, I'd probably put all my eggs in that basket for the first 2 years of schooling. The math people and the science people wouldn't like me, but it's so fundamental. Kids who don't succeed at reading, they don't go very far when they start to flounder in math and science as well, because it's being able to read is critical for those domains as well. It's ultimately important for their long-term health and well-being. Youth who arrive at high school who are still struggling readers, most often they're prone to depression, they're prone to dropping out of school, prone to not getting good jobs, and so on. That most critical transition is that transition from learning to read to reading to learn. We often talk about the transition into kindergarten as being the critical transition, but I really think that transition at the end of grade 3 is the most important one. And for most of the students, this occurs at around age 8 or 9. So the critical outcomes then are phonemic awareness, being able to hear and know the sounds that are associated with particular words in our sound system. And phonics, the ability to put those sounds together and understand how they form words. Vocabulary, fluency, being able to read at a fast pace and understand what you're reading, the comprehension part of it. What does it involve? It involves systematic direct instruction in reading. It happens naturally for a lot of children, but for a lot of children it doesn't. You need systematic instruction in reading. Daily exposure to a variety of texts, vocabulary and comprehension instruction taught directly, and an integration of both reading and writing skills. We use the term "don't wait to fail." My view is that in a lot of school systems, we see kids go through kindergarten, and they're probably in the bottom end of those graphs I just showed you, but nobody worries, because maybe they're Leo, the late bloomers, and they're going to blossom when they hit grade 1. And they go through grade 1, and maybe they're still haven't connected yet, and nobody's really worried yet. Round about the middle of grade 2, some alarm bells go up, and they say, well, this child isn't reading, and maybe this child needs to go down and get a little bit of learning assistance. And most often it's too little too late. And what do we do then? We fail a child. We fail a child either literally by recycling them back through the same grade again. And of all the research in education, that's probably the most widely researched policy intervention is grade retention. And it doesn't work. Kids who retain a grade are retained most often, nearly always, don't improve their trajectories. They stay on slow trajectories, and then you get an overlay of behavioral problems and all the rest. The other way we fail kids is we move them on to the next grade without giving them the intervention they should have. So-called social promotion. I'm not for social promotion, I'm for good interventions. And that's the difference. You need to have about 100 to 150 hours of systematic direct instruction to get those kids back on track. And Torgerson, who's really the prominent academic in this field, who's done a lot of studies with children looking at different kinds of reading interventions, suggests that a medium to strong intervention would be about 120 to 150 hours of direct instruction, usually in a small group of 1 or 2 or 3 kids. So don't wait to fail. Literacy trajectories are established early. Children on a low trajectory tend to stay on that trajectory and fall further behind. The later children are identified as needing help, the more difficult it is to catch up. Let me move into the adolescent domain. now. We talked about Tell Them From Me, this online evaluation system, where we're really trying to measure school climate, but also measure aspects of students' engagement and their health and wellness. And I've listed engagement in school activities and engagement in academic and intellectual pursuits. And then we have health and wellness. We're interested in self-esteem, physical activity, anxiety and depression, and participation in so-called risky behaviors, things like drugs, alcohol, early sexuality, all those things that parents like me with daughters coming up worry about, and the son. And then we know that those things are driven by a lot of things that are going on in the family, just as early outcomes are, but also a lot of aspects of school climate. In the work that we've done with the Program of International Student Assessment and the Trends in International Math and Science Study, we've got a pretty good handle on what that package of school climate variables are. Three of my favorite picks are the disciplinary climate of the classroom. In every single study I've done throughout a 20-year career, that's always come out as an extremely important measure. Not disciplinary climate of the school, but the actual classroom, of what's going on in the classroom. Academic press, which has to do with high expectations. There's a feeling among students that the teacher cares about them, but the teacher also has high expectations for achievement. And that's driven in part by the principal who sets expectations for the school. So that notion of academic press really permeates the whole school. And then the third one is positive student-teacher relations, that students have a sense that they're cared for by their teachers, that their teachers are really looking out for them. So there's our survey on Tell Them From Me, and I'll just say a few things about some of the measures. When we think about self-esteem or anxiety and depression, I think about the work that a lot of criminologists have done. And if you look into the criminology literature and look at aberrant behaviors among teens, they have what's called the age crime curve. And the age crime curve is you don't see much delinquent behavior until about age 11 or 12, and then it rises up right through to about age 17, and then it tends to fall off, and the fall off is more gradual than the rise. All right? So that age crime curve actually applies to a lot of the kinds of social measures that we're measuring in Tell Them From Me. So there's our measures. We measure self-esteem, depression, anxiety, bullying, smoking, and time on physical activity. We've also been asked to measure alcohol and drug use, but we've kind of shied away from that because some districts want it, some don't. Well, here's the age crime curve, if you will, for self-esteem, only because self-esteem is a positive outcome. Instead of rising up and leveling off, it goes the other way. There's a lot of debate about whether there were gender differences in self-esteem, and whether we knew that it fell throughout the middle and high school years. And what we're finding from our National Longitudinal Survey is that it falls for both boys and girls, but it falls particularly quickly for girls. Girls' self-esteem basically plummets during those middle and high school years, starting at about age 10. For girls, it's also related to socioeconomic status. Girls from poorer families, self-esteem goes down even harder than it does for girls from higher socioeconomic families. For boys, that's not the case. It's falling gradually for both boys from rich and poor families alike. We also look at participation in sports, and there too you can see this rapid decline throughout the middle and high school years. This graph shows the participation in school sports by grade level, starting out in the middle school grades with more than half of the kids participating in school sports, falling off, staying up around 50%. Once they hit high school, it starts to fall, and it falls year by year. In Tell 'em From Me, we also measure depression. We have a number of questions that ask about kids' feelings in general. Depression has to do with not being able to find much joy in life, being sad most of the time. But part of it's a prolonged period of time. We all go through periods of depression. But kids who are depressed, it'll last for 2 or 3 weeks and even longer. And for many kids who are depressed, they're unable to concentrate in class. The other measure is anxiety. And anxiety and depression kind of go hand in hand. Anxiety, if you can just imagine yourself when you're panicked about something, you have a panic attack and you get that heart going, you might be sweaty, all kinds of those kinds of intense reactions. Some children experience that a lot throughout their schooling time, especially certain social situations. They're afraid to be called upon by the teacher and so on. So we had Alexa Bagnall, Dr. Alexa Bagnall at the IWK Children's Hospital in Halifax help us develop these measures for Tell 'em From Me. And we got our first wave of data in on about 4,000 or 5,000 students, and I rushed off to Halifax to show her the results, and I said, gee, the curve goes like this, and I think we ought to cut the curve off here. And that, if I cut the curve there and said these kids are depressed or these kids are anxious, I would have had about 25%. She said, oh no, that's way too high. You never get away with that. And yet, that's what the distribution actually looks like. And so what we've done in Tell 'em From Me is we have identified kids who are kind of moderately depressed. You could say that they're at risk of becoming depressed in a clinical sense. You know, Dr. Alexa Bagnall would deal with those kids that are out on the extreme end of the curve. Right? And so we identify kids who are moderately depressed, moderately anxious, and anxious. And the idea of Tell 'em From Me is to get schools to think about, well, what does it take to get kids out of that yellow zone into the green zone? And as you move kids from the yellow zone to the green zone, you create an environment that is better for all kids and hopefully reduce depression amongst those kids that are having more severe problems. When we look at the correlations among the outcomes that we measure in Tell 'em From Me, sports participation, self-esteem, and so on, one of the things that we find is that participation in school sports and physical activity are protective factors for anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and low sense of belonging at school. In other words, it's a powerful intervention in and of itself, school sports, keeping kids involved and engaged in school activities. We get the same effects with clubs, hobby clubs and stuff at school, but not nearly as strong as we do for participation in sports. In all of these measures, when we look across the schools, we have over 100 schools involved in Tell 'em From Me at this point. And schools vary substantially in these outcomes. You can identify schools where average levels of self-esteem are higher than some other schools, or schools that have a much higher prevalence of children with anxiety and depression versus other schools. We've also been looking at smoking behavior. Just like the other outcomes, kids get initiated in smoking around about age 11 or 12, and the curve goes up, and in Canada it levels out around 17 or 18%. But there too we can see a lot of variation among schools in the percentage of kids who are regular smokers. If you talk to most adults who smoke, you'll find, you ask them, when did you first start smoking? Nearly all of them, without exception, will tell you somewhere between ages 12 and 15, maybe even a bit younger. You very seldom will run into someone saying, well, I started smoking at age 20. It just doesn't happen. So the tobacco companies know that. They've got to get those kids started in that age range. And I think it's very useful to track this in a school and look at what kinds of interventions can keep kids from initiating that behavior. Thank you.